Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Real inspiration for real innovators. If you're looking for innovation and leadership transformation, your journey starts now.
Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Born. I would love for you to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts so that other innovators like you can find us. And don't forget, we are on YouTube now. So head over there, hit that subscribe button, and follow us so that you can get more content. Well, today we are talking to Sunny Han. Sunny is the CEO and founder of Fulcrum. It's a manufacturing ERP platform dedicated to helping manufacturers build a better future. He led Fulcrum to raise a $3.1 million seed round of venture capital in 2020. Welcome to the podcast, Sunny.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, hey, listen, I would love to talk a little bit about your founder backstory. I always love when we have founders on just to talk a little bit about, how did you even come up with the idea? How did you get to the point where you guys decided to raise some seed money for the venture?
Yeah, I think probably the most direct answer to that is that when we started the company, the goal was to build something that would be meaningful to the way that the economy works, the way that our civilization works. There's a lot of experiences that we all had when we first started. Obviously, we're very tech focused. A lot of our team members back then, our founding team, had a lot of experience in tech. But we also had a lot of experience working with small businesses, a lot of experience working with manufacturing, as well as a lot of different industries. So at the time, I thought I needed to have some really crisp answer as to exactly what our mission was. It was somehow divinely inspired. But the truth is that we built a bunch of stuff. We talked to a huge number of companies. We were on site with 150 different businesses over the course of 3 years and just built stuff. Thought, what problems can we solve? What problems exist out there? And a theme that kept recurring back and back and back was this concept of all of the products and architectures that are out there that help manufacturers operate their businesses. They're just really, really old. And that might be okay. There's a lot of other industries that are run on really old stuff. There's the airline industry, notably, right? Most of the back end technology is 40, 50 years old. But for manufacturing, it's one of those things that's actually holding us back. And I know this sounds really naive, but as a kid, I didn't really understand how much manufacturing there is. But as I work deeper and deeper in this industry over the last decade and a half, the more I realize everything is made. I look around and I see all these objects and all these components, and I try to imagine like what shop did different pieces of it. So it's really cool. It's really cool to kind of find that. But for us, the founding story is really just about genuinely trying to come up with answers that maybe our customers couldn't come up with because they don't have the deep technological background that we do, but having enough empathy to understand what their lives are like so we can apply that knowledge to their lives. So our entire product history is really just about that, asking a ton of questions and asking in a way that is genuinely about understanding instead of just trying to sound smart.
Yeah. So are you, would you say your background is a technical background? Did you, as you started to come up with the ideas for this company and starting to meet with over 150 customers, is your background naturally technical?
I would say so. Like I grew up, I don't know, especially advanced in math and science stuff. I learned to code when I was a little kid. I was 7 years old. We had a computer in my bedroom because my mom was a grad student and she was studying computer science. So nothing I decided, just lucked into it, just had that opportunity. And so wrote a few really small programs as a little kid. I started taking math at the University of Minnesota in elementary school and started taking college level math really early. So I do have that background. But on the other side, I've never been a professional software developer. I've never worked at a big tech company. I've never written code in a professional setting. So at the company, I have this weird spot where I have a really great intuition about what to build, how long it might take to build, is it even feasible? But none of our engineers would want me to commit code to the code base. I don't, I don't really kind of know how to work on a team like that. So I think I'm embarrassed about that a little bit. But what it helps me do that maybe other more technical founders struggle with is it makes me very easily realize that our engineers are way better than me and will always be, and kind of let that go and not worry about it. I think the primary advantage that I think I have is I think I have a lot of empathy for when things go wrong, that I can trust a smart group of people to go fix it. And that I understand how software is made enough that I just get the fact that really smart people can still create bugs.
Yeah,
And it
that's
doesn't mean
right.
that they're bad or lazy or whatever it may be. So I would say that I'm technically very empathetic leader, I guess, is that I think a lot about the technology portion of it.
Yeah. It's funny. Maybe you've heard this phrase before. Oftentimes we hear this phrase that the strength of the founder can become the weakness of the organization. And the fact that you're saying, hey, I'm going to step back and realize there are other people that can do that better so that I can go think on other things. That's, I think, actually an important principle for founders to not try to keep getting back into the thing that they gave over to someone else. I think that is when their strength becomes a weakness, when they need to be pacing themselves and growing as a CEO, but they're still trying to get in the code base and commit changes. And so I just appreciate that about you, that you're like, hey, there are people that can do it so much better, and I need to kind of unleash them to do their job, and then I can be free to do mine. I think that's a big principle there.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's cool. So I have another question, and you kind of mentioned it earlier when you were talking about, just antiquated software. I've worked in many different large organizations. I would say people would be shocked to know how much of these big organizations run on antiquated software. And I would say one of the main things that I've seen that where does that matter? Why does it matter? Where do they struggle? And it's in this ability to scale. I mean, I think it almost becomes impossible for these organizations to scale the way they want to, and then they begin to take on all this technical debt. So I loved that when you got into this industry, you looked around and you said, "Hey, there are things out there, but they're antiquated." And so us building it, we can be more nimble, we can scale it faster, and we can respond to the customer, which I think is such an important part of an organization's journey, is to be able to actually listen to the customer and respond in a timely manner.
Absolutely. I think there's this, I don't know, phrase that's said often that if you can see what something could become, you get really motivated and passion to build something. But it actually is kind of a curse, right? Like there's a lot of studies that are done about how the viability of a company has far more statistically to do with timing than it has to do with the team or the industry or how antiquated the software is. So I worry about that I can't let go of this vision of a product that I want to build, and how these companies will look after they use our product. But I worry, like I obviously can't predict the future. I hope this is the right timing for what we're doing. It seems like it from our growth and our data points, but yeah, the one thing that I've started to try to coach the team on is these systems don't exist because of some conspiracy. They exist because they're useful, right? They've helped the company 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, however long ago. But for whatever point in time they adopted this technology, they had some use for it that they didn't let it go. They didn't go backwards, right? So, not taking that into account, just looking at what things are bad and saying, we can do it better. I think every one of our mistakes from a product standpoint was because of that we didn't understand some of the simple stuff that is antiquated. If we don't replicate it and do a better job of that, the boring stuff that just works, they actually lose something, right? That boring stuff actually has some value. So I think the challenge with taking a bunch of really smart people that work at really advanced technological companies is they obviously see all the opportunities, but they might not always see all the things that are extremely boring and mundane, but are also extremely valuable.
That's Man, that's really wise. And I think I, I worked on acquisition and integration for a long time, and that was always the argument, right? Whenever we would purchase a company, bring them onto our platform in 6 months, it was always this idea that um, everyone wanted to chase the newest feature or the best feature. And there's some things, especially when you're doing that integration internationally, where you're like, hey, this isn't just a nice feature, it's also the law, right? You're like, this thing also legally has to be built in. So I think there's some wisdom in what you're saying of just because it's newer doesn't mean it's better. We have to, again, go back to what you were saying when you were meeting with all those customers. It's like, we've got to understand their business. We have to understand what they're trying to accomplish and make sure that we're building that into whatever we build for them, which I think is super wise. So I know you said you can't read the future, but if we were a futurist, what would you say are some things that you just feel like are ripe for disruption in the manufacturing industry, maybe manufacturing technology industry, in and of itself?
I think that manufacturing has always been the first adopter of technology to some extent. All of the ERP systems we see today, whether they're for airlines or for service companies or for manufacturers, the first versions of all of them were built for manufacturing. Um, Even just the concept of a database or a computer controlled piece of machinery, all of that happened in manufacturing first. There's a wild statistic that 40% of all software engineers in the 1980s were working on something manufacturing related. And I think we kind of don't think about that, right? We don't think about that because the internet has kind of taken over. So um, the way that I see things have happened in the supply chain in general in manufacturing is we've done a lot to create mechanical muscles, things that are moving giant blocks of objects around that are heavy or maybe that are hard to coordinate. You have little robots that are zipping around, picking stuff off the shelf, and drones that are taking inventory of stuff. A lot of really cool things that are happening. I think the next step is creating that mechanical mind, and it isn't replacing humans. I think that there's a misnomer that machines are going to replace humans. Maybe, but certainly not in the next 10 or 15 or 20 years. I think what the next phase is taking all the things that we try to hold in our heads to coordinate our business jobs, and putting it in a way where it's automatically connected with each other. One example is it usually takes a tribe of dozens, if not hundreds, of different smaller manufacturers to make a plane or to make a rocket or to make a car. And that process of creating this network of manufacturers, it has to exist. We have to coordinate. It's no different than having a giant potluck where everybody has to bring everything, and else has to come together at the exact right way in the end. And we see this, right? We see COVID having caused little perturbations in the way that the supply chain worked, and the entire end product wasn't able to be finished because of one bolt or one screw or one PC board. Because of that network being analog, me and you emailing each other or sending PDFs back and forth or having a phone call or a voice chat, um, because it's analog, it's really difficult to re-coordinate. I imagine a digital network that's automatically connected, and we can then focus on designing a better product or coordinating our businesses a little bit better. But this knowledge of when is some component going to be ready and how late is it going to be or how early is it, all of that can be computed automatically and coordinated between hundreds of businesses in a really clever orchestration. And if we can accomplish that, we can unlock huge amounts of productivity. We can just make way more things with the stuff that we have right now.
Wow, I feel like you said a lot there, and I think that that's a huge shift for an industry that in some ways is extremely advanced technologically, and in other ways you would look at it and say, hey, this industry is probably 5 to 10 years behind other industries in other areas. And so I just obviously you can't read the future, but future wise, I think that was just a very interesting insight that you shared with us. What would you say as you're thinking about your own organization, your own company? What are some of the goals that you guys have for the future? I mean, I think it's really fun to sit in the seat that you sit in and to look out and say, hey, how can we impact and affect the world around us with the work that we do? So what are some of the things that you guys are thinking about as you look on the horizon?
Yeah, I think we're in a period of a lot of change. I mean, everybody's experiencing it. We have tasted the benefits of remote work, but we've also felt maybe some melancholy in losing in-person interaction. So right now, this week, right, we have the entire company here in Minneapolis at our headquarters. Our team is roughly 50% remote, 50% in person, and it's been really good to see everybody in person. And so whenever there's a huge change in the way that people work or the world in general, we kind of have an opportunity to vote on how we want the future to be. And as a kid, I always thought that politicians and CEOs and leaders had a very easy job. The answers seem obvious in retrospect, right? But when you're in the moment of trying to decide, is this the way that we want to vote? You realize that it isn't about being right or wrong. It's about your preference. And maybe your preference doesn't actually fit that well in the world. And maybe you have to change your preference. And that kind of dynamic of how do we fit what we want into the world that's changing around us, that I think is the existential question that we're answering right now over the next couple of years. I I believe that we want to be in person at least a significant amount of the time, but we want to give that flexibility as well. And you can say that and wave a wand and it feels really magical, but executing it in a way that retains freedom while also retaining effectivity, it seems impossible without a huge amount of thought. And I think that's what every organization philosophically deals with as they grow. When you're really, really small, you can have a lot more individuality between people. When you're a 500,000 person company, it just wouldn't work for you not to give up some freedom for the greater good, right? And we experience this as a country as well, is that we have to balance this question of individuality versus communalism. And we're making that shift right now. I think one thing I didn't realize early on is that when you grow a company or a team 3x every year for multiple years in a row, you're kind of really rapidly sprinting through these evolutionary phases of choosing those things. And I think the emotion is a combination of nostalgia for the past and excitement for the future. But if you go through that process too fast, you just make people feel this crazy tension of, should I be hanging on to the past? Should I be living in the moment? Should I be thinking about the future? Because the human brain is not really trained or meant to think about change in the terms of weeks or months, but instead years, right? We go to high school for 4 years, we go to college for 4 years. If in 4 years you go from 4 employees to 500, it's just really difficult to deal with that. So for me, it's a battle to keep certain values that we have and choose which values we give up. And I know that sounds sad, but I think as we grow, we have to conscientiously give up some values that were really important to us, but also add new values that will become more important to us as we grow. And those choices, I think, are the ones that are my focus over the next year, because I think that will, set the stage for what the culture will be 10 years from now.
Yeah. That's I think that's really important for people to hear. Our values do change over time. Our values change as well as we learn things. And so something we valued 10 years ago may not be what we value today. Or we may get to the other side of that value and realize the value has shifted and changed and now it's taking new shape. So I really I love what you're saying because I think this is an important thing for organizations to lean into, especially when they go through the trouble to put their values on the wall. Sometimes it can feel like you've got to put a stake in the ground and stick with those. But I love to just hear that you're continually evaluating your values and where they're going. There's something you said that was really interesting as you were talking about kind of this hard decision a CEO has to make. Kind of you're at the crossroads, and it's do we go left or right? And it reminded me of when you were talking about that the story. Most people know it about iPhone and Nokia in that like 2004 to 2007 timeframe, where Nokia was spending like $22 billion in R&D, and iPhone was spending about, or Apple was spending about, 2.5 billion. And Nokia had put all their money into the idea that people wanted to continue to have these low cost phones. Meanwhile, Apple put all their money into the idea that people wanted this, what we would call today a smartphone. And so it's funny when you read that case study, they talk about it as this slow moving train wreck. And I think that happens when we start to get separated from our customer and separate it from their needs and separate it from where they're headed and what's important to them. And that's, to me, how I would connect the dots with the evolving values, is that we have to stay close to the people using the product, because that's how we kind of understand what they're valuing. And if their values shift and we stay over here, we're going to miss the mark. We're not going to hit, what they're asking us for.
Yeah, I think it's, at least in America, almost like a cultural precedent that leads to that. in school, we kind of train people that there's a known answer that if you get right, you get points, and we give you a little dopamine hit, right? And so some folks that come from school, that we onboard, extremely smart people that are now really great team members, almost everybody that comes directly from that environment has a little bit of a struggle point coming into our organization where they have a thought process where they believe an answer exists and they're finding it and trying to answer the question correctly instead of discovering it through asking questions, right? And I think if you start, like in Nokia's case, with some assumptions that you think are true and then ask questions about how you solve it, you skip this entire kind of realm of answers that are possible. Whereas if you start with the questions first and then say, okay, here is how the world actually is, let's go make this or build this or create this, you just get a lot better answers. Internally, we have this mantra where we say, try to get as close to the trunk and the root of the tree as possible. Because I think you can get fooled that the leaf is the actual root knowledge, and you have to trace it all the way back sometimes to find a new answer. Because you can be really close to the answer, but on just a completely different branch, and nothing will make sense until you go back to that root knowledge. So,
Wow. That was, I'm like, that is almost like I felt like I was in a philosophy class for a second. Cause I think you're right. That was such a deep answer that I'm like, I feel like I need like, a couple hours to sit with what you just said and think about that. I mean, I think that there's so much wisdom in that. And again, I think it's the speed at which we're going as a, society, that in order to trace back to the root in the trunk, you have to slow down. You have to think about it. You have to, be going slow enough to ask the right questions. And I think sometimes we're moving so fast that we don't have time to slow down and think about what you just said. But I feel like I'm going to listen to that 5 or 10 times. That was very wise. What final thoughts would you have for our listeners as you, even as you think about your own journey, as a startup, what final thoughts would you have?
well, I think selfishly, my thoughts are always around the things that are happening right now. But for me, there are things that we talk about that are values that are kind of agnostic to how the world is moving, and so those will likely stay very, very stable over time. But what I think happens is as things get harder and more complicated, it's actually easy to slip out of them without realizing it. So we say people first, the people build the product. And if we have really great people working in a really great way together, the product will be great. And then we can care about profit last. So, having raised over $20 million total, it makes it easier to care about profit last. But uh, I think as we grow the team and we have knowledge ourselves, it's really easy for us to commit the same sins that allowed for our opportunity to exist. So we have a lot of knowledge here already. And when new people come aboard, when we were 10 people in size, I think we were just much more open to their new perspectives, even if they were wrong. Now that we know a lot, we have this kind of increased judginess against new people's ideas that we have to fight with internally. And so sometimes I pick my head up and I look around and I see us doing things that feel like they're part of our cultural values, but they really aren't. And I think it's because we've advanced and grown and developed some things that have made us really successful. And we say, why would you, disrupt the cart? Well, isn't that the very reason why we exist in the first place? So um, right now in the moment, I think my current thoughts are all around how do you know whether something that's new is good or not, and how you should handle that. How can you maintain an open mind as an organization while still protecting some of the truths that you found? And I think that's been a harder question for me to answer than I thought, but that's really the existential thing that I'm thinking about right now. So
I love that. And I think that's an awesome final thought for the people listening, which is maybe you need to answer that question for yourself as well, because I think that it's important. And oftentimes you're right. We build our culture on yes, and then later on we kind of begin to build it on, no, we've tried that before. And so
yep.
just going back to yes, and I think is a very powerful thought to end with. Where can people follow you?
Uh, Anybody that listens to a podcast can always reach me at my email directly. It's sunny like the weather, sunny at fulcrumpro.com. But my LinkedIn, there's not that many Sonny Hans, that work at a company called Fulcrum. So you can reach out and LinkedIn me, and I'll accept your connection. And I don't really post on Twitter or anywhere else, but those are probably the two best places to follow me.
Awesome. Well, Sonny, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. It was a great conversation.
Yeah,
Appreciate
this was
it.
awesome. Well, to our listeners, thank you for joining the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Remember, don't just get out of the box, break the box and set it on fire. Let's go transform something.
Thank you for joining us for the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Be sure to subscribe to our show on iTunes. Follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Innovation Meets Leadership, and visit our site at innovationmeetsleadership.com for more innovation resources.